My name is Sonia Aggarwal. I'm a member of Young China Watchers here in San Francisco, and I'm delighted to be your host for this event. Young China Watchers San Francisco has about 500 members, and globally, Young China Watchers has about 5,000 members. So we're excited to host these events and to have you guys participate. In addition to this event, we also have a few events coming up in the next few months. We'll be having a venture capital panelist for YSW San Francisco, and we'll also we'll be having a roundtable on trade policy. So we'll be sending you emails as those come up. For now, I'm excited to welcome our esteemed speaker. Kun-Chin Lin is a university lecturer in politics and Suffian College lecturer and fellow at Gonville and Caius College at the University of Cambridge. He is also the acting director for the Center for Geopolitics and senior fellow for the Center of Industrial Sustainability at Cambridge. Dr. Lin received his BA from Harvard University and received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Which brings us to our moderator, Professor Vinod K. Aggarwal. He is the Travers Family Senior Faculty Fellow and Professor in the Department of Political Science, an affiliated professor at the Haas School of Business, and a director of the Berkeley Apex Study Center, of which Dr. Lin is an alumnus. Dr. Lin did his PhD with Vinod Aggarwal, who, in full disclosure, is my father. So we're excited to see this conversation unfold. We'll be talking about China's maritime ambitions, particularly with an eye toward the South China Sea, but also beyond in its maritime policy. And also we have the benefit of having Dr. Lin, who also explores space policy, and maybe if we bully him enough, he'll mention that as well. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Kun-Chin Lin, and the moderator, Dr. Vinod K. Aggarwal. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kun-Chin, for joining us. And I wanted to start out, we know a little bit about your background, your degrees, but tell us, how did you get interested in looking at US-China relations? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Thanks, Vinny. I also want to thank Sonia and Fred for inviting me to meet you. Actually, I've been in touch with Sue and Tay in your London branch, who's graciously invited me to evening talks, but that was before the lockdown, so now we're all stuck in my little Cambridge place, which is dark and cold outside, which is very, very typical of English weather. So as you might have guessed from the hyphen in my first name, I was born in Taipei. And like many immigrant families back then, my parents moved me to New York at a tender age of 11. So I went through the public schools in Queens and Westchester and went to Harvard, aspiring to be a mathematician. The year was 1991. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and Harvard opportunistically imported numerous geniuses from Russia, who promptly showed me that the gap in innate human talent was immense. So in my despair, I spent all my time coxing, rowing, and learning about Chinese history and politics. You see, when I was in elementary school back in Taiwan, Taiwan was still under martial law and authoritarian information control. So school children knew next to nothing about the PRC, or Taiwan for that matter. So at Harvard, my eyes were opened. I learned about Cultural Revolution from Roderick McFarquhar, IR from Alastair Johnston, political economy from Jing Oi, history from William Kirby. And so I made the switch of major and got my degree in government and went to Berkeley for the PhD. So under your wise guidance, Vinny, I focused on Chinese political economy. So mainly the relationship between the state and the market in the organization of state-owned enterprises in China, the capitalization and regulation of national champions, and the trade and investment regime that China established to control its interface with the global economy. So I got a Fulbright and David Bourne Fellowship to do my fieldwork in China on Chinese oil companies. And since then, my research has focused on markets and infrastructure. So it includes things like the fiscal model and division of labor between Beijing and local governments in fueling highway constructions, the introduction of independent regulators and marketization of electricity, power producers in China, and latest, the expansion of Chinese ports, shipping and logistics networks in Asia. So that's kind of where it all got started. I've taught at NUS, I've taught at King's College London and Cambridge since 2011. So that has really given me a lot of opportunity to speak to policymakers and military and businesses. Cambridge is only an hour away from London, so there's no sense of the ivory tower divide, except maybe in the inhibited minds of academics. As Sonia mentioned, I direct the Center for Geopolitics here, and I'll be very, I'll appreciate if you go to our website. There's 30 plus webinars and blogs on geopolitics and the pandemic. So yeah, my interest in China has been a personal journey over the past 20 years. So I'm very pleased to share some thoughts with you.
Thank you, Kun-Chin. So let's jump right into a provocative and a key issues. So over the past few months, we've seen intensified military activity in the South China Seas and the Taiwan Strait, frequent warship, jet fighter activity, missiles being fired into the sea from China. And then there's a recent video from the PLA Air Force featuring a simulated airstrike on Guam, clips from 2 Hollywood films, The Rock and The Hurt Locker. And the editor-in-chief of the hawkish media Global Times warned in a tweet that Mr. Trump could, quote, launch a drone attack on Chinese bases in the South China Sea, to which the PLA will definitely fight back fiercely and let those who start the war pay a heavy price. This sounds like the beginning of a conflict and a Cold War, if not Cold War, even worse. Tell us your thoughts on that.
Oh boy, you sure put me in a tough spot right at the start. Oh well, okay. South China Sea is undoubtedly one of the 2 most likely locations for US-China armed conflict, right? The other location is obviously Taiwan. So let's consider the appetite and capability for a naval war between these 2 powers. Now, the Chinese party and military leaders have reiterated frequently that they will go to war if there's American military presence in Taiwan. So this is under the Domestic Anti-Secession Act passed back in 2005. Now, South China Sea has been proclaimed as a core interest of the PRC since 2010. But the red line for military action has never been fully specified. So there are obviously complex scenarios linking the 2, right? So you can have tension over Taiwan Straits, which could be redirected to actions in South China Sea to avoid casualties and loss of face. On the other hand, you can have sort of China-US skirmishes in South China Sea, which could involve the Taiping Island, which is the biggest sort of island feature in the region under Taiwanese control, which will then spill over. And then China could always shell Taiwan, as it has done on several occasions in the past, usually to test the extent of American military commitment. So the key thing to keep in mind is that there are next to no civilians in the South China Sea. While there are 23 million Taiwanese on the island and many more on the coastal cities of Fujian, Guangdong, and Hainan, right? So attacking Taiwan will be the next level game changer, whereas South China Sea, might not be all that bad if all sides play it right. So as you mentioned, recently Pentagon officials and RAND corporations have run a series of war games involving Chinese attempt to seize Taiwan, which shockingly have produced, losses for American military. So, these scenarios usually start with a massive attack by Chinese missiles against the American targets, Okinawa, Guam, its ships and aircraft carrier groups and whatever. And it usually results from the Americans trying to, shoot down most of these missiles or the amphibious sort of, vehicles and not being able to do all of that. So eventually, in 2 days, the Americans will lose thousands of lives and billions of dollars of equipment. So that's the kind of war games that most American strategists are looking at. And you can imagine, how they feel about that, right? So, but that's predicated on the fact that we're, estimating Chinese military capability as well. And we know the Chinese have been growing quite, by leaps and bounds in technology and all that. But the interesting thing is the human element of warfare, right? So the psychology of that. So we know that the Chinese are very far behind because the PLA has not fought a war since 1979, in which it was demolished by an experienced Vietnamese army. The PLA has never fought a naval war and has never fought a space cyber coordinated war like the ones that Americans fight in Iraq and elsewhere. So the PLA generals call this the peace disease, like essentially they're just not, morale would just fall apart. So that's the problem, right? So the question is, what are the more likely scenario if both countries are not willing to go all out attack on each other? Well, one thing would be a small scale exchange of fires. You wipe out a few military installations on Chinese islands, or you could have another scenario which really worries some strategists, which is conflicts arising from unintended consequences of escalations. So ships colliding, shooting down spy planes, you feel like you have to respond to that. So the increasing traffic over the past few months over this, military, the maritime space really escalated these possibilities. But I would say that the political controls for these kind of scenarios are manageable. And the audience cost is not great because, like I said, there's no casualties, no civilians in South China Sea.
So thank you. That's a very nice overview. But if I'd like to talk more about the South China Sea in terms of Chinese general strategy. We've seen China very active on the border with India, with a number of other countries, and those are kind of disputes that it has, territorial disputes. What's the big excitement of the South China Sea? I know there's some resources there, but it seems that this has become like such a huge deal and the most important issue between the United States and China after Taiwan. Can you tell us a little more about how do the Chinese perceive the importance of the South China Sea for them, which seems to be irritating a lot of the previous allies they had in the region where they were doing well to, get good relations with Malaysia and so on, Vietnam. Now everybody sort of hates them.
Yeah, no, I know. Well, I mean, if you want to read up on this, I have a report for the Chatham House a few years ago called Maritime Asia, Maritime Security in Asia. So feel free to look that up. But basically, I mean, I think most of our audience will probably know something about this. But so let me just emphasize a few so interesting and less well explored points. One is that, we're talking about the importance of South China Sea, especially the sovereignty and territorial claims, come from an unfinished nation building project, right? We remember the Qing Court taking abuses from the great Western maritime powers. And the Republic of China, sought to establish its claim over South China Sea by borrowing the names of places from maps of Western explorers and companies. They actually had no capacity to send ships to South China Sea. So they just copy these maps and draw a line around and say, this is, Chinese water, right? And you remember that Republican government was very involved in international law, right? So, founding member of the League of Nations. So this was something, the legal consciousness aspect was really important. So the Communist Chinese inherited these claims. And when China was ready to open up to the world in the 70s, Zhou Enlai famously told the Japanese that, the settlement of these territorial claims in the case of Japan's East China Sea was not important. That's just not worried about, right? So the main thing is that China wanted to rejoin the international market and communities. But the interesting thing about that is that at the same time, when China took over the seat of the Chinese seat in the UN, this was when the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea was being negotiated. So this is the constitution of the sea for the world. It's one of the first regimes that China fully participated in, but the legal regime was never completed. And what it masks is this sort of contention between US and Western naval powers that favored open seas and developing countries that wanted more territorial rights. So in a way, China is a manifestation of these unresolved conflicts. Now, in 2009, China responded to the Philippines because Philippines declared under UNCLOS, the Convention of the Law of the Sea, that it has certain claims over seabed, hydrocarbon stuff. So that has led to this 10 years of massive escalation of Chinese military activities in the region. You all know about the land reclamation project, which is taking up something like 300,000 square meters of the sea. You know about the confrontations between China and Vietnam and US forces. Like Benny has said, it really led to this aggressive statement that's really incongruous with the so-called harmonious rise, and win-win outcomes of the Chinese diplomatic discourse, right? So China's baseline is this. It has historical claims over the sea. It's a latecomer compared to Philippines and Vietnam in terms of the free-for-all games of island occupation and resource exploration. And lastly, and this is an important point, is that it was reacting to Obama, the whole pivot to Asia, right? Which has intensified the Chinese insecurity and the need for peripheral defense. So those are the three core arguments I think the Chinese have been trying to make to justify its so-called aggressiveness.
So when we think about China's maritime strategy, which you've written about and thought about a lot, is this all part of this kind of struggle for hegemony in the area, the movement towards a bipolar world, and this idea that the Chinese are trying to break through the island chains and they're going to have an aggressive naval strategy because the United States Seventh Fleet has always dominated the Pacific. And this looks like an effort by the Chinese to say, okay, we're not going to be contained by the American Seventh Fleet. Is that how you see it in terms of a grand strategy that the Chinese are now employing vis-a-vis the US?
Yeah, that certainly sounds like what you've been reading in the mainstream press, doesn't it? I mean, I think the Secretary of State, Pompeo, in his recent speeches, he's really effectively defined the US position as the enforcer, almost the unilateral enforcer of this rule-based international order. And so in that discourse, he consistently points out South China Sea as a demonstration of China's sort of lack of respect for international law and the interests of its neighbors. So the irony, of course, is that China makes the same pitch on the United States, right? So to the rest of the world, it just seems like a struggle of titans where both sides escalate, diplomatic and military measures without regard for regional stability. So I'll accept the premise that you just, you proposed about, this sort of power struggle, that ultimately China would like to displace American power from the region, right? So by 2049, Xi Jinping has promised China would become a global leader in terms of its power and influence and build an international order that's centered around China's national rejuvenation project, right? That's pretty clear. And if you sort of follow the kind of, development of the doctrines, the military, projects and all that, it's pretty clear, what the Chinese want. However, I think it's probably misleading to characterize this maritime contention on the sort of 2D visualization of this two island chain. So you mentioned this island chain argument, which is, for those of us who haven't really paid attention to this, means that Americans have these sort of defense alliances ranging from Japan all the way down to, Singapore. And then it has the second chain, Hawaii, Guam, and all that. So China feels that it's been trapped in these two island chains in terms of its maritime development. I think that's a really misleading understanding of Chinese grand strategy. I mean, for one thing, the PLA Navy is not going to be the American Navy anytime soon, right? And its sort of doctrinary revisions and equipment upgrades have not aimed to do so. If you look at what kind of stuff that equipment that the Chinese Navy is invested on, it's focused on deterring American freedom of navigation and protection of Taiwan and things like that. Very specific forms of deterrence, access, denial, that type of stuff. Second, I think the Chinese objectives with its military movements in the region are intrinsically political rather than military. And this is something we expect from sort of communist China, right? I mean, the activities of Chinese governments usually has a higher political objective than other ones. So the idea is to dismantle American alliances in the region. And they're already doing that with a mix of sort of diplomatic and economic incentives on one hand, and then coercion on the other. So these smaller powers in the region have always pursued this so-called hedging strategy. So to avoid choosing a side and then to do deals with both sides. And the Chinese have tried to cast doubt on that strategy and the value of American security relations with these kind of mix of benefits and coercion. So in the case of Vietnam and Philippines and even Indonesia, China is basically trying to show these countries that the American freedom of navigation missions and international law cannot protect their fishermen and their oil companies from being chased away by armed Chinese vessels. So the point is that the countries then have to recognize, okay, look, this is the reality we have to accept. And we just have to deal with the Chinese. Of course, I mean, this could backfire, right? So we see that countries like Vietnam, Philippines, Japan, Australia, and even India are now entering into stronger relations with Americans to protect their interests. But I think there's more than that. I think the 2D image of maritime space so missed several dimensions of strategic value to China. So you guys, I mean, I'm sure many of you are involved in sort of global trade, and we know that South China Sea is a very strategic location, right? $5.3 billion of trade, trillion dollars of trade transit every year. Close to 90% of energy import to Northeast Asia have to go through the Malacca Strait. It's a critical junction of the eastbound Suez Canal versus the Panama Canal, so container shipping routes for Asian exporters to US markets, right? So, I mean, that's the aggregate picture. But I think the sea is also very interesting as an asset in different ways. I mean, first of all, the sea is really hard to enclose and defend, right? It's not the borders that we see with India, right, where China moves troops in and whatever else. The resources are often hidden and mobile at sea. Fish don't respect international maritime delimitation, right? And as the sort of China-Japan disputes in South China Sea also shows, oil and gas deposits cut across bilaterally agreed lines, right? So when China began to destroy coral reefs with its deep sea trawlers and stuff like that and build up artificial islands, it has a huge broad externality on the whole region's ecology. And so maritime resources have been really important for the diet and the economy of Southeast Asian countries. And this is something that's will lead to the tragedy of commons if countries cannot agree to cooperate in the region. So that's one thing, like that whole dimension of ecology and food security and energy security is oftentimes not appreciated. And this is why a lot of analysts and EU policymakers are talking about the maritime commons. So that's one aspect of it. I'd like to tell you more about, sort of reserves in South China Sea if Vinny will permit me.
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, good. Thanks. Okay, so a lot of people will tell you that China is interested in South China Sea because of oil and gas. Don't take that too seriously, okay? So the last serious estimate they made about, the oil and gas reserves in South China Sea was back in the late 1960s. And even based on those estimations, the kind of oil the Chinese could get out of, the reserves in the South China Seabed is probably not enough for even a few days of Chinese energy security. So currently, the Chinese national oil companies are only getting about 1% of daily production out of East China Sea, right? This is the place where it's close to the Japanese, which is basically insignificant for domestic consumption. So it's not so much oil. What is this about is rare earth materials. So South China Sea has massive deposits of ferrous manganese crusts and nodes or nodules, they call it. And that's where the deposits of precious minerals are likely to be found and could be accessible for mining. Now, you and I know that rare earth materials are critical inputs in this sort of growing electronics, renewable energy sectors, right? Batteries, whatever, right? China controls the production of 90+% of global rare earth. Now, much of that production is actually inside China, but other things like cobalt, in Congo, where Chinese invested mine controls the production. But the emerging area for these rare earth materials and mining is undersea. The technologies has only matured in recent decade, and the commercial case remain uncertain for private Western firms, which means that it's a perfect situation for the Chinese state-owned enterprises, right? They invest in it for the long run. So China has more mining exploration areas in international waters than any other country. So, currently they have something like, in early 2000s, the Chinese developed this framework called 863 programs, which supports research with military civilian fusion, applications. And China lined up industrial policy, opened their deep pockets, did merger and acquisitions with Western firms to acquire technologies for these deep mining explorations. So right now they have something like 3 of the 27 licenses given by the International Seabed Authority for deep sea mining in international waters. And so their focus has been on the Pacific Ocean, the so-called Ring of Fire, which is a sort of series of volcanic fissures between the tectonic plates where the nodes of minerals are found. So right now, there are no mining license allowed for the South China Sea. And that's not so much because China is not interested, but because China is waiting to establish control before testing the limits of international law. So the cost of extraction is nothing compared to the establishment of sovereignty and control over these territories. So that's the key thing. So in recent years, just the past year, actually a few months, China established 2 new research stations on these artificial islands in Fairy Cross Reef and Subi Reef, where it has put in exploration and exploitation of deep sea environment, fuel, rare earth materials, and biotechnology. And that's what they want to go for, right? Biotechnology, we know, there's lots of stuff to be mined in the sea, sea creatures for biotechnology. So that's really interesting, right? And you will imagine if this whole decoupling goes forward, US-China decoupling, even more reason for China to invest in these kind of stuff. The strategic leverage is massive.
Well, let me turn to a slightly different issue. I understand the importance of the sea. I think I did not really realize about the rare earths. That's a very interesting, insightful point you made. But at one level, it seems all very old-fashioned and maritime policy, very 19th century, maybe early 20th century, where the Germans fighting the British on the oceans and so on. And now we live in a world where we have cyber warfare, we have AI issues, AI, quantum computing, and so on. from what I've done some research on, I mean, the Chinese seem to be very interested in those issues as well. So are they pursuing all of this in parallel? Do they have some grand strategies? Is South China Sea and the oceans just one aspect of it? I mean, I know you primarily work on maritime, but I want to sort of poke you a little bit and say, aren't you really old-fashioned focusing on this old thing, maritime, when there's all this cool stuff happening in cyber and space and all that stuff?
Vinny, are you telling me that Graham Allison is not cool?
That's right.
A lot of your colleagues refer to 19th century geopolitics to understand China. Anyways, I'm just kidding. All right. You're right. Okay, absolutely. Now you got to think about the sea from a 21st century technological perspective. Okay, so I've mentioned sort of this whole, sort of strategic importance of South China Sea, but I think I haven't told you about this very important technological dimension deriving from the very location of the South China Sea. So you're probably aware that Hainan Dao, the island Hainan, is sort of a very interesting place. It's a free port that China is trying to promote into this free, sort of port zone, free trade zone. And it's a massive tourist, location. But what it really is a sort of combination of the Maxwell Air Base in Alabama, the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and the San Diego Naval Port, all rolled into one for China. Now, why? I mean, why this island? It's a very good reason for it. Hainan is the southernmost territory of China. Its latitude is 19.5 degrees north, exactly the same as Hawaii. Why? Well, okay, now the South China Sea Reclamation Islands are even closer to the equator. Now, why do we care about this? Okay, well, the physicists and the engineers among you can give me a more polished explanation than I can offer you. Nowhere near that. But the main intuition is actually quite simple. To have the kind of global coverage, the collection of crucial weather information, the support of global communications network, and the production of real-time satellite image, high resolution image that the US military and companies have, China needs to place satellite tracking stations as close to the equator as possible. And that's where Hainan and South China Sea comes in. And that's because the physics of this whole geostationary orbit, which basically means a circular sort of geosynchronous orbit around the Earth's equator planes. So you have these satellites which remain in relation, so the same position to the sky as the observer on the surface. So the tracking stations don't have to sort of move around. They can sort of focus on the satellite and get the best connections. So that's a very important part of, how you lay out the satellites and how you track them. Another part, which I'd love to tell you another time, is the Monia orbit, which actually spins around the Earth. And so you need tracking station in the North Pole for high inclination orbiting satellites. Once you combine the geostationary satellites that are tracked around the equator and the North Pole tracking ones, you've got the world covered in real time and high resolution. And if you're talking about hypersonic missiles, you need this, absolutely. So we know that China has been expanding big times in the European Arctic and working with Russians to build infrastructure in the Russian Arctic. Guess why? It's all a part of the same strategy, right? So this is a different story I'd like to tell you another time. Right, so this all links to, Vinny, what you're talking about, this, sort of the new idea of the multi-domain warfare, right? Where the maritime control is directly linked to cyber, space, and new land-based capabilities like these hypersonic missiles I talked to you about. So, I mean, yes, while traditional geopolitics matter, technology has made a huge difference. And this is why South China Sea is more important than ever. It's not about aircraft carriers and submarines anymore.
So going back a little bit to our previous history, if I may, we used to write about regionalism in the old days when you were at Berkeley. And we used to talk about ASEAN and ASEAN being a key player, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And they were trying to make these trade agreements with Korea, with Japan and China. And ASEAN viewed itself as kind of the leader, the centerpiece for the Asia Pacific. Of course, the US always wanted to participate in the Asia Pacific. And yet over time, it looks like everyone's no longer talking about ASEAN. Nobody pays attention to ASEAN, poor ASEAN. And everybody talks about China and SCO and the Belt and Road Initiative that China's pursuing, some of these pretty unilateral in their measures. And of course, China has recently signed RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, when India refused to sign it for various domestic economic reasons. So has essentially ASEAN been put by the wayside, and China has basically begun to dominate, not only in terms of the military and things you've been talking about, but also in terms of institution building in the region. Just this morning, there was a good story in the Atlantic about how the Chinese are doing very well in terms of international organizations, the specialized agencies of the United Nations like FAO, WHO, and so on. So while the Trump administration has abandoned international institutions to a large extent, it looks like the Chinese suddenly are very interested in that, which is kind of ironic because many people say the Chinese are interested in only very hard power, military power, and yet they seem to be obsessed with international organizations and regional institutions. So it's kind of a long question, but maybe you can talk a little bit about where do these institutions fit into the grand strategy that you've talked about?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I have a slightly different perspective than the one you just laid out. I mean, of course, I agree with you, right? I mean, one thing is that ASEAN and other Asian regional integration efforts have always had the problem of, the norms of voluntarism, right? You don't force any country to do anything against their will, and aversion to institutionalization, right? So, when I used to teach at Singapore, there was that tiny office that was, the headquarters of ASEAN Secretariat. So, it's never going to be like the EU. But I think what we've seen is that China has really taken advantage of these weaknesses, these inherent regional political cultural weaknesses, to restructure crucial relationships. So over the past 20 years, in your work, you have pointed out that China has proposed bilateral FTAs, investment treaties, and it's also promoted more recently under Xi Jinping discourses of community, of common destiny, win-win outcomes, and try to offer economic incentives through BRI and the Asia Infrastructure Investment Banks. That seem to offer the kind of normative flexibility, fewer political conditionalities, and weak non-compliance consequences for these countries. Now, that could gain you friends in the short term, but the question is, what is this? Okay, so one set of questions, how sustainable is this strategy, right? And the other thing is, how does that fit with China's action in the South China Sea? Now, there are sort of two views on this. One is that the conventional view is that BRI and South China Sea are part of China's grand strategy, right? So, they work alongside each other. But from that perspective, you got to start thinking that, BRI and South China Sea have encountered sort of basically countervailing responses from a lot of countries recently, right? So Japan, US, Australia, and other countries have, for economic and security reasons, essentially, mounted, either resistance or even alternatives to the Chinese effort. And this potentially could lead to a sort of reconfiguration of ASEAN, or Asian regionalism, really. I don't see really ASEAN taking a lead role in this, but you see Quad, right? India is getting interested in this. Whole concept of Indo-Pacific, the French and the Germans are proposing to join it. We don't know what that means exactly, but certainly there's that potential there. We also have to remember that, of course, China, in its weakened economic state now, is not going to be able to fund BRI to the extent it has before, right? So, once the money runs dry, how do countries react? The second view, which is actually more interesting, can be detected in the careful wordings of Chinese academic output, which is that BRI and South China Sea are essentially contradictory. South China Sea is undermining Asia regionalism, and that's not good for China, right? So the argument here is that, South China Sea actions promote militarism and traps Chinese military resources in a way that doesn't support the neo-mercantilism of BRI. If you want to do neo-mercantilism, you don't bottle up your near sea and attack other countries. You have open sea policy, blue water navy, good relations with neighbors, protection of your merchant fleets as a priority, and support of the maritime commons. That's what you do if you want to win the sea. So, I mean, the Chinese, have pointed this out. Why are we spending all this money on that reclamation project when we should be, doing other stuff? So I guess the key thing here is the strategic problem of, the hedging strategy of smaller powers, right? So if you're going to have regionalism, you got to talk about secondary powers, not just the great powers. And problem with countries like Singapore is that while the existing institutions and power structures are falling apart, right? ASEAN is one, yeah, right? The Chinese have not proposed any workable alternatives and ways to diffuse this geopolitical power struggle. So countries can't really play hedging games when there's not a stable basis of support institutionally and politically. I guess that's something that political scientists hasn't really looked into, is that they are preconditions for hedging, and that's disappearing quick.
But there seems to be, I mean, along these lines of the contradiction. I mean, the Chinese have signed RCEP, our regional comprehensive, with a lot of, I mean, the ASEAN countries. At the same time, they've also annoyed ASEAN countries like Vietnam. There was a case, of course, we didn't talk much about that, with the Philippines, where the Philippines won the case on the island dispute, and yet they decided not to pursue it because they were sort of worried about the Chinese or whatever. I don't understand exactly why the Philippines did that. But so I'm a little confused here. So it looks like the Southeast Asian countries are in fact able to hedge. They can go along with China and RCEP, and then they complain a little bit, and Vietnam has quite bad relations with China, and yet they're willing to sign RCEP. So there's a disjuncture between political strategy and economic strategy. They still want to be economically involved with China, and yet they're politically resistant and worried, especially with US withdrawal to some extent from the region with Trump. They're kind of worried about what's going to happen if China dominates. But they are kind of playing this odd game where economically they're sort of moving forward with China, and yet politically they're hedging and they're very resistant. So they've almost bandwagoned economically, if I might say, and they're hedging when it comes to politics. And is that a sustainable thing? Can you really have a separate political, especially for the Chinese, separate political dimension when you have this economic integration?
I don't think so. You're absolutely right. I maybe last year I might have been more hesitant, but I think after this year, with the decoupling clearly going forward, it's not a sustainable strategy, right? So RCEP doesn't address these fundamental issues of global value chains. It doesn't address a lot of things about procurement and sort of rules of origin. I mean, it's a lower standard than TPP, as you know. So what you just said about separating the economic and security dimensions only works if there's a basic understanding that Americans don't mind that separation. When Americans, your crucial security ally, says, I care about these issues together, right? The whole weaponization of economic sphere is the primary discourse nowadays in DC. So they're not going to accept that. I really think this past year has made RCEP even less attractive as a solution. It could be a band-aid solution, sort of thing, but it's not going to be a solution for regional integration in the future.
Well, we have a very excited audience who would like to ask you some questions, so I'm going to keep my mouth shut for a little while. Turn it over to Sonia, who's going to manage those questions. And if there's time, I still have a couple of questions about Mr. Trump, which I can't resist to ask you at some point, and also, of course, about the pandemic. But I'll hold off on my questions and turn it over to Sonia, who's going to take over at this point and ask her own and audience questions.
Thank you. And again, if you have any questions, please enter them through the chat box and we'll get to them. The first question I have for you comes from Charlie Wang on the topic of institutionalism. There has been some chatter about forming a NATO-like alliance in Asia to oppose China's influence. How feasible is this?
Well, this is, I mean, they're sort of, sorry, Vinny, I'll just, answer it. This has been discussed prior to the Trump administration, right? So one resource I might refer you to, I think it's Obama's former Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter. So he wrote a piece for Belfer Center Report 2018, where he basically talked about this whole, principled inclusive network as the sort of bedrock of American foreign policy. So he talked about how, the advantage of the US is to mobilize these alliances, but the track record doesn't support his proposal in the sense that, there are always problems with Australia wanting to be a part of something, India has always been very insistent on its sort of non-alignment, it doesn't want to get involved in ASEAN when it's been approached by ASEAN in the past. And now because of the border skirmish, it shows some more interest, but it's really doubtful how much it would actually contribute if a sort of collective security institution is formed. Even, sitting here in Cambridge, right? So the British have been sending their warships and they'll be sending their best, the newest warship, Queen Elizabeth II, to South China Sea in the coming year. And the thing is that that's not always something that even Australia agrees to support. Britain has sent its warship mainly because the French are there from time to time. And so, it wants to support Americans, be the sort of, good citizen in a rules-based international order. But what real interest does Britain have to do these kind of things, FO emissions? So I think, the kind of distribution of the resources and responsibilities to form this security alliance is far from clarified. And now every country expressed its interest to do so. Japan, very interested in all that. But it's not clear to me that the Quad or anything similar to that would take off anytime soon.
And bringing us back to maritime disputes, we have a question from Matt Kennedy. He wants to know, how do you see the Sino-Japanese dispute over the ECS as influencing plans capability development?
That's a very interesting question. Matt, I seem to remember you. Do you have any expertise on this? I don't want to maybe you should be telling us more about it. Yeah, I mean, obviously, the sort of interesting thing about East China Sea is obviously that China did have an agreement with Japan a few years back, and due to disputes over distribution of the resources, the Chinese sort of said, okay, look, we're going to step back. What we agreed on, it no longer applies. And East China Sea is one of the key regions for Chinese development of external sort of oil resources. But I mean, right now, the other interesting thing is, of course, all the airplanes that are flying by there, all the claims of, ADIZs, defense identification zones, and the Koreans are also involved in that region as well. So it's a very complicated region. Whether that has developed, contributed to development of naval doctrines, per doctrine as strategies, I would say it's probably less important than South China Sea. I have not seen direct evidence that East China Sea is being used, war gamed, if you want to call it that, as a scenario for the Chinese doctrinary development. But that could just be due to the fact that I haven't read enough. So, Matt, if you have new information to share, I'd love to hear it.
Thank you, Dr. Lin. And another question we have is about China's satellite systems. What amount of land is necessary for equatorial tracking? The equatorial tracking stations you mentioned that are critical for China's global satellite systems. Is it just a dish on a shelf of rock, or is there a substantial amount of land that's required? And how has China gone about obtaining that land?
That's very interesting. And this is something I'm trying to figure out myself. So, I mean, I do need to talk to people in the Pacific Command and other places to figure out, if the Chinese are putting some of these satellites on these islands, how many of them would actually reach a critical mass to mean anything? I don't know, but I'll be more than happy to report back to you once I find out more about it.
Thank you. And if anyone else has any additional questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat. I'm going to turn it back to Professor Aggarwal to keep asking Dr. Lin some more questions.
Okay, well, I do hope we have some more questions because I can talk forever like a good academic, but I do want to ask you about the pandemic. We've been listening to this in American debates, as you may have watched our vice presidential debate and our very exciting presidential debate, if you could call it a debate. I'm not sure that would be the definition of a debate, but turning to this question of the pandemic, I mean, it seems, if the statistics are accurate, the Chinese have actually basically conquered the COVID-19. We in America and the Europeans are having an outbreak, second outbreak, and so on. Is this, I mean, Trump goes around calling this the China virus. Is this something that the Chinese see? For example, after 2008, many people said in China, well, the West has been defeated because of their bad financial planning and mismanagement, and now is the time for China to rise further and go away from China's peaceful rise to a more aggressive rise. We see wolf warrior diplomacy, and some people talk about that. But now with the pandemic, if the Chinese have actually conquered the pandemic, so have the Taiwanese, of course, and New Zealand, but those are much smaller. But a big country like China able to deal with the pandemic, does this mean that the Chinese will say, okay, now we can move forward while these other countries in Europe and the United States are essentially weakened by their inability to control COVID-19?
That's a really good question. I think as a China watcher, the problem is that, well, I mean, speaking only for myself, I'm sure many of you have better networks than I, but the information, reliable information coming out of China has really reduced in terms of what we can learn about what's happening in China in real time. And we know that official figures are, what is Mike Pompeo's word for that? Is to distrust and verify, right? So you can't really just accept it as it is. And we know that the flooding, all sorts of other problems. The swine flu is still in force; it's rising again, which devastates the agricultural sectors. There are various things happening. You remember back in the two sessions back in May, Li Keqiang pointed out something like the prime minister, so what do you call it, Premier Li Keqiang pointed out that 600 million Chinese below poverty line. So I think there's a recognition that China is weakened significantly and is still in the middle of a serious economic crisis. And this is not something that's communicated, obviously, by the propaganda department of the CCP, but this is something that's very evident if you start paying attention to reports from the ground and various indicators. You look at consumer index. So China has been increasing its trade deficit with the US. But if you look at that, there's some displacement effects where China is doing more exports with ASEAN and Europe, less with US. That's understandable, but its demand is declining. And many of you who are in the financial sector, can tell us more about this. But I mean, we always hear sort of more positive news from the banks, but I'm quite skeptical of the internal balancing capability of China, i.e. its ability to take advantage of the current circumstance to strengthen its relative power against America. I think it's very difficult. And if you look at sort of BRI as this external projection of Chinese economic power, it's not really going anywhere. And China is facing this very real possibility that all these countries will start defaulting on the loans to the Chinese. And that will be a very difficult diplomatic situation. Now, do you try to renegotiate and forgive loans, as China mostly has done the past few years? Or do you want to get some back, some returns back and hold countries accountable for it? So I think all these are difficult strategies. So I would be skeptical in arguing that China will be taking advantage of the situation to move forward. I think, domestic, sort of consolidating domestic situation, stabilizing it is probably the priority at this point. I mean, of course, there will always be this sort of public diplomacy thing going on, which gives us the impression that China is doing really well. I would not take that too seriously. But the other thing I think about pandemic, the more serious thing, the one that's deserving of academic research, is really the kind of effects it has on industry level, right? So I pay attention to I study ports and sort of shipping industry, and that's a massive change going on right now, right? So the ports have bounced back in terms of international trade, has bounced back a bit, but right before the pandemic, the Chinese ports. If you ever go to Chinese ports, they're beautiful, right? High tech, digitalized, everything's wonderful. And then if you study the transport cost in China, right? So per good exported to America, how much percentage of that good is actually locked in transportation. It's huge. It's like 15-16%. And much of that is intermodality, right? So, goods come in, highly digitalized ports, can't get out. You get on the highway and you're stuck for weeks, right? So all these kind of problems, intermodality and all that, right now there's an opportunity to completely restructure that. So a lot of these port authorities are discussing pushing ahead with digitalization, right? We know these blockchains, for invoicing and everything has worked really well for the shipping industry. And you push ahead with this implementation of the green requirements. So the International Maritime Organization, IMO, the big organization that self-governs these shipping industries, has issued a lot of new environmental pollution regulations. This is the time to implement it. The governments are subsidizing ports. They're putting money into it. Let's change it. So with that transformation and with the sort of disruptions in the supply chains, with this decoupling, there's a lot of opportunities for countries to restructure their industries. And I think that's actually the long-term consequence of pandemic, which will affect the competitiveness of countries like Indonesia, Philippines, and all that, and also as well US in the region. So I think that's the more interesting for me, the more interesting puzzle to research question to pursue.
Well, we have more audience questions, so I'm going to turn it over to Sonia to ask you.
Thank you. Keeping in mind this new environmental impact, we have a question from Martin Hoogland, who says, you spoke about the South China Sea and the artificial islands that are being formed. From an environmental perspective, perspective, to what extent do you believe that this sets a dangerous precedent?
I absolutely believe in it. I mean, there's no question about it. So if you want to look into this, there's beginning to be some literature on this, but there's this guy, James Bolton. He's at Tufts. He's an affiliate visiting scholar there. And he has really done a lot of work on this. But the main thing is that everyone agrees, so all marine economists and environmental scientists agree that this is a major disaster in the making. So the way that China has sort of trawled, the deep sea for resources, giant clams, fishes and everything like that, it basically means that within the next 5 to 10 years, the world's largest marine, most biodiverse marine ecology is going to be destroyed, right? No more sushi for you, right? I mean, this is a serious business. So there's currently basically just a tragedy of the commons because there's a lack of governance because countries are fighting over territories. So any kind of fisheries agreement that, Philippines, China, Taiwan, other countries have signed, eventually are disregarded because, there is a conflict going on. So yes, I think it sets a terrible precedent as to what's going to happen. And this is not just a matter of, like when you think about marine economy, it's not just fishermen, right? It's food security. It's a whole chain, supply chain. And for China, the maritime economy has always been a very dynamic sector. So the past 10, 15 years, a lot of GDP growth comes out of the maritime economy. And it's a way that it transitioned from primary goods like fishing, basically catching fishes, to building ships and to logistics and services. And that's something you want to keep developing. And then the sort of collapse of ecology is going to affect all that.
How do you, another question from Ariel Stenek, aside from the rare earth minerals and gas deposits below the continental shelf, how does China view harvesting live resources as a critical factor in controlling the South China Sea, or is this secondary to geostrategic considerations?
Yeah, I think fisheries is, the interesting thing is it could be used very politically. And the best example is, Brexit, right? So one of the two key discussions between the EU and Boris Johnson right now is fisheries. Who has control over the sea and who gets, the catch. So that is something that China has put on the table as, something to be discussed. So where if the countries can get into this sort of, joint development protocols, agreements to exploit resources jointly. I mean, this will be a very good first step towards stabilizing the region, and that that is clearly not the case now. So that's kind of the question. The way I'll answer the question is yes. If you simply look at fishing, it's obviously a declining industry, right? Except that it's still hugely important for food security and for the communities in Philippines, Indonesia, and elsewhere that live near the sea. But as a whole overall thing in GDP, it's the primary sector is not that important. But what's important is all the other associated broader ecological issues and also the potential for interstate agreement based on fisheries.
And from a defense perspective, does losing territorial claim over the South, will losing territorial claim over the South China Sea weaken the PRC's military strength in Taiwan? And how does this impact China's grand coherent grand strategy regionally and globally? Those are combined questions from Henry Bowler and Wincy Chen.
That's really interesting. So the point is that if the US were to retake these islands, bomb out, the military installations, including satellites, will this have an adverse effects on Chinese development in space and cyber and other things? Yes, it would. At the same time, there is always the Hainan Island, which the Americans will not touch, obviously, unless there's a full war going on. And the Chinese will still, it still has licenses to explore undersea resources. So that doesn't require these islands to be in Chinese hands. Furthermore, if you make these islands so common properties, then you could have joint as scientific explorations and other things, which will allow you to maintain that sort of dual use technology, and then the benefits of that. So I would say that yes, it will have an effect, but it could be mitigated in various ways. Sonia.
Okay. Given the current tech war between US and China, how does this impact the port's infrastructure development in ASEAN countries?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first order effect is the redirecting of the traffic, right? So some ports are falling apart because there's no traffic, and other ports are getting massive traffic. And that also has a second order effect on the special economic zones. So they're, the Chinese, usually they're interested in ports, not just for the ports. They're interested in the land development around the ports, building that sort of, industry belts around it and all that. And most of these port development projects don't get anywhere. So, the Cambodian there's several pro projects you can go and take a look at it, and it's clearly that they're just falling apart. They're becoming, areas of corruptions, casinos is the, game in town. But there are other areas that are growing very fast. So I think the whole global value chain restructuring would lead to these ports being upgraded. Another sort of interesting effect is actually the ports not in Southeast Asia, but in the United States. So over the past, well, so some of you might be aware, in 2016, the Panama Canal was expanded. So it's now accommodates these huge, ships, container ships, as well as LNG carriers. So a lot of American ports in the East Coast have expanded because of that. Now, the key thing is that if ASEAN and Japan and Taiwan begin to orient their trade towards America through the Panama Canal because of decoupling, rather than putting their goods through China in container ships that mostly go to the the Suez Canal. So the Chinese route is, strongly favoring the Suez Canal to reach the European market. Then you could have a sort of golden age of, port redevelopment in America as well. So I think this is all, what Vinny has told me really well to do is just to track, global commerce and see, how that's changing because of these political, shocks.
And bringing us back to the military exercises, we've seen several military exercises in the South China Sea between Hainan and Paracel Islands. There are currently 2 aircraft carriers. Military exercises obviously require months of planning and are not reactionary, but does this show of force by the PLA and the PRC demonstrate growing confidence in their military capabilities? Or is this just seen as traditional posturing, traditional exercises?
Well, I mean, a lot of these military exercises are more posturing than anything else. And they're not entirely inflexible. Yeah, of course, they require tons of planning, but if someone gets COVID, right, you could shut down a serious component of, major component of these exercises. I mean, I think they are mostly so confidence building measures and signaling of coalitions, right? So USSR, sorry, I just regress back to the Cold War era, right? So that's a Freudian slip on my part. But, the Russians and the Chinese have been doing a lot of joint naval exercises throughout Europe, the Mediterraneans, and South China Sea. And that's really interesting because, the Russians obviously need Chinese support in revitalizing some of their technological bases, industry bases, their, hinterland regions. And doing these joint exercises is a signal that they're building confidence, because the main thing about these exercises, and military guys, in our community can tell us more about it, is the whole notion of interoperability, right? If you have 2 militaries coming together, the whole chain of command, the kind of stuff you do, the order you give, have to be integrated. That's what signals, when the 2 militaries are really working together and open to each other. And that's the important thing.
Thank you so much, Suffian, and thank you for joining us and answering all of our questions. I'll leave it to you and Professor Aggarwal to wrap up.
Well, I just want to thank you, Kun-Chin, for an excellent presentation. I always come to a lot of talks and I don't feel I've learned anything, but I've learned so much with this talk, and don't think I'm an expert yet on maritime ports, but I'm glad we have one here. And I think it has great implications for US-China relations. I didn't get to ask my question about what's going to happen under Biden versus Trump, but maybe you can just give us 1 minute on that, just as I'm dying to ask that question.
Well, okay. Well, okay, let me just say it, as succinctly as I can, right? So I think that, obviously we all expect Biden to go back to some of the, tried and true principles under the Obama regime government. But the main thing is this, right? There's a new regional military and economic reality, and there are new sets of principles that American foreign policy is operating by. We all know that after 2020, you cannot simply discount China as a competitor, right? So to use the same means to achieve very different ends in a different context is not going to work very well. So there are going to be serious fiscal and political constraints as well, both parts, Americans and the Chinese, to pursue these strategies and to reach out with deliverables for allies, right? So before the pandemic, I was talking to American policymakers and they're saying, oh, we're going to have this sizable fund to counter BRI. Really? Are we going to have to, how are we going to do that, right? And the Chinese are like, we will fundraise through the Hong Kong markets, to build up our BRI. Really? With Hong Kong's reputation in tatters? Really? So I think all these are very interesting things. I just don't think, we'll have to be innovative. We have to be entrepreneurial. And I think policymakers need to come up with a new set of options. I would like to come back after the election and do another topic with you if I'm invited. And to fulfill Sonia's expectation, I want to talk about space, the next frontier of great power competition.
Thank you, Kun-Chin. Really appreciate your participation.
And thank you so much, Dr. Aggarwal and Dr. Lin, for joining us. And thank you to the Young China Watchers community for joining this talk. We appreciate your questions and we hope to see you at our upcoming events. Thanks, everyone.